The morning sun barely peeked through the dusty windows of the small cabin when Margaret O'Brien heard the news that would change her life forever. She was kneading bread dough, her hands working the sticky mess while flour dusted her worn apron. The smell of coffee filled the cramped kitchen where she and her father had shared countless quiet mornings since her mother died 3 years ago. "Margaret, sit down," her father said, his voice carrying a weight she'd never heard before. Thomas O'Brien was a man of few words, weathered by years of fighting the harsh Oregon Territory soil for every potato and grain of wheat. His calloused hands shook slightly as he poured himself another cup of coffee. She wiped her floury hands on her apron and took the wooden chair across from him. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Outside, their old rooster crowed, and she could hear the wind whistling through the gaps in their cabin walls. "There's something we need to discuss," he began, avoiding her eyes. "About your future." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. At 17, she knew this conversation would come eventually. Most girls her age were already married with babies on their hips. But she had hoped for more time, maybe even a choice in the matter. "Jeremiah Blackwood has asked for your hand," her father said quickly, as if ripping off a bandage might make it hurt less. The words hit her like a physical blow. Jeremiah Blackwood was a name whispered about in town, never spoken too loudly. He owned the largest ranch in the territory, had more cattle than anyone could count, and a big house that people said was finer than anything back east. He was also 43 years old and had buried 3 wives already. "No," Margaret said simply, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. Her father's weathered face hardened. "This isn't a discussion, girl. It's decided. I won't marry him, Papa." She stood up from the table, her chair scraping against the rough wooden floor. "You can't make me." Thomas O'Brien had never raised his voice to his daughter, but his patience was wearing thin. The creditors had been circling their small farm like vultures for months. The banknote was due, and he had nowhere near enough money to pay it. Blackwood's offer had come like an answer to desperate prayers. "You don't understand what's at stake here," he said, his voice rising. "We'll lose everything. The farm, the house, everything your mother and I built together." Margaret had noticed the worried looks, the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She knew money was tight, but she hadn't realized how desperate things had become. Still, the thought of marrying Jeremiah Blackwood made her skin crawl. She had seen him in town just last month. He was a big man with cold gray eyes and hands that seemed to grab whatever he wanted. She had watched him strike one of his ranch hands across the face for spilling grain from a feed sack. The way he looked at women made her want to hide behind her father's broad shoulders. "There has to be another way," she pleaded. "I could work in town, maybe for Mrs. Henderson at the general store, or we could sell some of the land." Her father shook his head sadly. "The land's not worth enough to matter, and Mrs. Henderson can barely afford to pay her own son. Blackwood is offering enough money to clear our debts and set us up proper." "What about his wives, Papa? All 3 of them died so young." Thomas waved his hand dismissively. "Childbirth takes many women. It's just bad luck." But Margaret had heard the whispers. "Blackwood's first wife died after falling down the stairs. The second one drowned in the creek behind their house, even though she was known to be a strong swimmer. The third wife died from a fever that came on sudden and left just as quick. People talked, but quietly, because Jeremiah Blackwood was not a man you crossed if you wanted to stay healthy. The days that followed were filled with tension. Margaret refused to discuss wedding plans or meet with the preacher. She barely spoke to her father, and when she did, it was only to repeat that she would not marry Blackwood. Thomas grew more frustrated each day, caught between his daughter's stubborn will and the crushing weight of his debts. The breaking point came when Blackwood himself rode up to their cabin one afternoon. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the thunder of hooves. She peeked around the corner and saw him dismounting from his massive black horse, his silver spurs jangling with each step. He was even more intimidating up close than she remembered. His expensive leather coat and polished boots made their humble cabin look even shabbier. When he smiled, it never reached his cold eyes. "Thomas," he called out in his booming voice, I've come to meet my bride." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She slipped through the back door and into her small bedroom, pressing her ear against the thin wall to listen. "She's just shy," she heard her father say. "Young girls get nervous about such things." "Shy is one thing," Blackwood's voice carried easily through the walls. "But I hear she's been downright defiant. That kind of behavior needs to be corrected before it becomes a habit." There was something in his tone that made Margaret's blood run cold. This wasn't a man who would be patient with a reluctant wife. This was someone who expected complete obedience and wouldn't hesitate to enforce it. "Margaret," her father called, "come out here and meet Mr. Blackwood properly." She stayed frozen in her room, her heart beating so loud she was sure they could hear it in the next room. "Margaret Elizabeth O'Brien, you get out here right now." Her father's voice carried the edge of real anger. Slowly, she opened her bedroom door and stepped into the main room. Blackwood's eyes traveled over her like she was livestock he was considering purchasing. She felt sick under his gaze. "Well now," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "you're even prettier than I remembered. We're going to get along just fine, you." "And the first, I won't marry you," Margaret said quietly, but her words carried clearly in the small room. The smile disappeared from Blackwood's face, like someone had blown out a candle. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I beg your pardon," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I said I won't marry you." This time her voice was stronger, though her hands shook at her sides. Thomas O'Brien's face went white as fresh snow. "Margaret, apologize right now." But Margaret stood her ground. "I'm sorry you rode all the way out here, Mr. Blackwood, but I won't be your wife." What happened next would be burned into Margaret's memory forever. Blackwood's face turned red, then purple. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment she thought he might strike her right there in front of her father. Instead, he turned to Thomas with a look that could have melted iron. "You said you could handle this?" "I can," Thomas stammered. "She just needs time to come around to the idea." "Time?" Blackwood's laugh was harsh and ugly. "Time is something I don't have patience for. The wedding is set for next month. If she's not ready to be a proper wife by then, I'll make sure she learns quickly enough afterward." After he left, the cabin felt smaller somehow, like his presence had sucked all the air out of it. Thomas and Margaret stared at each other across a divide that seemed to grow wider by the minute. "You've embarrassed me," her father said finally. "Embarrassed us both." "I won't marry him, Papa. I'd rather die first." Those words would prove to be more prophetic than she could have imagined. Because 3 days later, when Margaret saddled up their old moray and tried to ride away to her aunt's house in Sacramento, everything would change forever. Margaret's escape attempt lasted exactly 4 hours and 12 miles. She had waited until her father rode into town for supplies, then saddled their old Maury Bessie with shaking hands. Her heart pounded like a drum as she stuffed her few belongings into a canvas bag and tied it behind the saddle. The plan seemed simple enough. Ride hard to Sacramento, where her Aunt Ruth lived, stay there until she turned 18, then figure out what to do next. But Margaret had underestimated how quickly word traveled in the territory, and she had definitely underestimated Jeremiah Blackwood. She was following the old trading path through the pine forest when she heard the thunder of hooves behind her. 3 riders emerged from the dust cloud, and her blood turned to ice when she recognized the lead rider. It was Blackwood himself, his face dark with rage, flanked by 2 of his ranch hands. "Well, well," he called out as they surrounded her. "Look what we have here. A runaway bride." Margaret tried to urge Bessie forward, but the old mare was already winded from their hard ride. The men's horses were fresh and strong, cutting off any escape route. "Please," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just let me go. Find another woman to marry. There are plenty who would be happy to have you." Blackwood's laugh was cold as winter wind. "But I don't want another woman. I want you. And what Jeremiah Blackwood wants, he gets." One of the ranch hands, a thin man with a scraggly beard, looked uncomfortable. "Maybe we should just take her back to her father," he suggested quietly. "No." Blackwood's voice cut through the air like a knife. This little wildcat needs to learn some manners, and I'm going to be the one to teach them to her." They dragged Margaret from her horse and tied her hands with rough rope. The ride back to Blackwood's ranch was the longest hour of her life. She sat in front of him on his massive black stallion, feeling his breath on her neck as he whispered threats in her ear. "You're going to regret this little adventure," he said softly, so the other men couldn't hear. "I was planning to be gentle with you on our wedding night. But now you've shown me what kind of woman you really are." The Blackwood Ranch was bigger than anything Margaret had ever seen. The main house was 3 stories tall with white columns and wide porches that wrapped around the entire building. Dozens of cattle dotted the fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. Under different circumstances, she might have been impressed, but Blackwood didn't take her to the big house. Instead, he led her around to the back of the property, where the storage buildings stood. Behind the main barn was a small stone structure that looked like it had been built into the hillside. It was the root cellar where vegetables and preserved food were stored through the winter months. "This is going to be your new home," Blackwood said as he pulled open the heavy wooden door, "until you learn to behave like a proper woman should." The cellar was dark and damp, with stone walls that wept moisture and a dirt floor that felt cold even through her boots. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of preserved vegetables and sacks of potatoes. The air smelled of earth and rotting onions, but the worst part was what came next. Blackwood produced a set of iron shackles from a wooden crate, the kind used to restrain dangerous prisoners. The metal was cold and heavy, designed to break the spirit of anyone who wore them. "These belong to my grandfather," he said as he locked the shackles around her wrists and ankles. "He used them on runaway slaves down in Georgia." Funny how history repeats itself? The iron bit into her skin immediately. Margaret tried to pull her hands apart, but the chain between the shackles was only 2 feet long. The ones around her ankles were even worse, connected by a chain so short she could barely take normal steps. "You'll stay here until you're ready." "To apologize?" Blackwood said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "And I mean a real apology, on your knees begging for my forgiveness." "I'll never apologize to you," Margaret said, though her voice shook with fear. "We'll see about that." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Oh, and don't think about screaming for help. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and my men know better than to interfere with my business." The door slammed shut with a sound like thunder, and Margaret heard the heavy bar drop into place on the outside. She was alone in the darkness, with only the sound of her own breathing and the distant lowing of cattle. The first day was the hardest. Margaret paced the small space like a caged animal, testing every stone in the walls for weakness, examining every inch of the door for a way out. The shackles made everything difficult. She couldn't reach the high shelves, couldn't move quickly, couldn't even sit comfortably on the cold ground. Blackwood came to see her that evening, carrying a plate of bread and beans and a cup of water. He set them on the floor just inside the door, close enough that she could reach them, but far enough that she had to stretch painfully against the chains. "Hungry?" he asked with that cold smile. Margaret's stomach was growling, but she didn't answer. She had decided she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of begging for anything. "Suit yourself," he said. "Food will be here twice a day. When you're ready to apologize properly, just call out. Someone will hear you eventually." The second day was worse. Margaret's wrists and ankles were already raw from the iron rubbing against her skin. Every movement sent sharp pains up her arms and legs. The bread from the night before had grown moldy in the damp air, but she ate it anyway. She needed her strength. Blackwood's visits became a daily ritual of cruelty. He would bring food and water, but always just out of easy reach. He would talk to her like she was a child who had misbehaved, his voice alternating between false kindness and barely controlled rage. "This is all your fault, you know," he said on the 4th day as Margaret struggled to reach the cup of water he had placed deliberately far from her. "If you had just been a good girl and accepted your father's arrangement, you'd be planning a wedding right now instead of living like an animal." Margaret's throat was so dry she could barely speak, but she managed to croak out, I'd rather be an animal than your wife." That was the day he first raised his hand to her. The slap echoed off the stone walls like a gunshot, and Margaret tasted blood where her teeth cut her lip, but she didn't cry. She wouldn't give him that victory. "You will break," he said quietly, rubbing his knuckles. "They always do eventually. My first wife thought she was strong too, so did the second one. And the third." His eyes grew distant for a moment, remembering something that made his smile turn cruel. But they all learned to be obedient in the end. As the days blurred together, Margaret began to understand just how much danger she was in. This wasn't just about forcing her into marriage. This was about breaking her completely, turning her into something that would never again dare to defy him. She had heard whispers about his previous wives, but now she was beginning to understand what might have really happened to them. The infection started on the 7th day. Where the iron rubbed against her skin, angry red welts had formed. Soon they began to ooze and fester. Margaret tried to keep them clean with the small amount of water she was given, but it wasn't enough. Fever began to set in, making her shiver in the cold cellar despite the sweat that beaded on her forehead. But even as her body weakened, her spirit remained unbroken. She used small stones to scratch marks on the wall, counting each day of her imprisonment. She made plans for escape, even though the shackles made them impossible. And she held on to one thought that kept her sane in the darkness. Someday, somehow, she would be free of this place and this man. She had no way of knowing that help was already watching from the forest beyond the ranch. Help that would come from the most unexpected source imaginable. The young Modoc warrior had been watching the white man's ranch for 3 days when he first saw the woman in chains. Choaks moved through the forest like a shadow, his moccasined feet making no sound on the carpet of pine needles. He had come to scout the area because his uncle, the great chief Kimpuash, needed to know what the settlers were planning. Tensions between his people and the white settlers had been growing worse each month. Choaks was only 22 years old, but he had already proven himself as one of the best scouts in his tribe. His eyes could spot movement from incredible distances, and his ears could pick up conversations carried on the wind. These skills had served his people well as they tried to navigate the dangerous waters between war and peace, but nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed on that cool autumn morning. He was crouched behind a massive pine tree, about 200 yards from the main ranch buildings, when he saw Jeremiah Blackwood emerge from what looked like a storage building built into the hillside. The white man was carrying a wooden bucket and seemed angry about something. Choaks had heard about Blackwood from other scouts. The man was known for his cruelty, not just to the Modoc people, but to his own workers as well. What happened next made Choaks's blood run cold. Blackwood disappeared into the stone building for several minutes. When he came out, he was dragging something behind him. At first, Choaks thought it might be a large sack or bundle of supplies. But then he saw the truth, and his hand instinctively moved to the knife at his belt. It was a woman, a young white woman, barely more than a girl, and she was bound in heavy iron chains that sparkled cruelly in the morning sunlight. The metal shackles around her wrists and ankles were connected by short chains that forced her to move in awkward, painful steps. Even from his distant hiding spot, Choaks could see that she was weak and struggling. Blackwood was shouting at her, his voice carrying across the open ground between the buildings. Choaks couldn't make out all the words, but the tone was clear enough. This was not a conversation between equals. This was someone with power tormenting someone without it. The woman said something back, her voice much quieter but carrying a note of defiance that surprised the young warrior. Most people, when faced with Blackwood's anger, cowered and begged. But this woman, despite her obvious weakness and the chains that bound her, was still fighting back with words. That's when Blackwood struck her. The sound of the blow echoed across the ranch yard like a gunshot. The woman stumbled but didn't fall, though Choaks could see her body trembling from his distant vantage point. Blackwood grabbed her by the arm and dragged her back toward the stone building, his movements rough and careless. Choaks had seen violence before. He was a warrior, after all, and his people had been fighting for their survival for years. But This was different. This wasn't combat between equals or even enemies meeting on a battlefield. This was cruelty for its own sake, the strong hurting the weak simply because they could. In Modoc culture, women were respected and protected. A man who treated a woman this way would face serious consequences from the tribal council. The idea of chaining a woman like an animal was so foreign to Choax that he struggled to process what he was seeing. He stayed hidden in the forest for the rest of that day, watching and learning. He saw Blackwood's ranch hands going about their daily work, tending cattle and repairing fences. None of them seemed to know about the woman in the stone building, or if they did know, they were pretending not to notice. Fear hung over the ranch like morning fog. Everyone was afraid of their boss. As the sun began to set, Choax made his way back to his temporary camp deeper in the forest. He built a small fire and tried to make sense of what he had witnessed. His original mission had been to gather information about settler activities, but now his mind was occupied with something else entirely. That night he barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman struggling with her chains, heard the sound of Blackwood's hand striking her face. By the time the sun rose, Choax had made a decision that would change everything. He would return to the ranch and learn more about what was happening there. The second day of watching was even worse than the first. Choax positioned himself closer to the buildings, using a fallen log and thick brush as cover. From this new position, he could see the stone building clearly, and even hear some of the conversations that took place near it. Blackwood visited the imprisoned woman twice that day. Both times, the encounters followed the same pattern. He would unlock the heavy wooden door and disappear inside for several minutes. Then would come the sound of raised voices, his booming and aggressive, hers weaker but still defiant. Sometimes there would be other sounds too, the rattle of chains, a cry of pain, the dull thud of something hitting the stone walls. When Blackwood emerged from these visits, his face was always flushed with anger. Whatever he was trying to accomplish with the woman, it wasn't working. She was not giving him what he wanted. On the third day, Choax witnessed something that made his decision for him. He was watching from his hiding spot when Blackwood stormed out of the main house, clearly in a rage about something. The white man marched across the yard to the stone building and threw open the door with such force that it slammed against the wall. "You think you're too good for me?" Blackwood's voice carried clearly across the distance. "You think someone is going to come rescue you? No one is coming, girl. No one even knows where you are." There was a pause, then the woman's voice, so weak that Choax had to strain to hear it. "My father will look for me." Blackwood's laughter was harsh and ugly. "Your father is the one who gave you to me in the first place. He took my money and signed the papers. As far as he's concerned, you're already my wife." What happened next was burned into Choax's memory forever. Blackwood dragged the woman out of the stone building, her chains clanking with each forced step. She could barely walk, and it was obvious that she was sick. Her face was pale, and there were infected wounds visible on her wrists where the iron had rubbed her skin raw. "Look around you," Blackwood said, gesturing broadly at the empty landscape. "See anyone coming to help? This is my land, as far as the eye can see. I am the law here." The woman tried to pull away from him, but the effort was too much for her weakened state. She stumbled and would have fallen if not for the grip he had on her arm. Choax could see that she was running a fever, her body shaking with chills, despite the warm afternoon sun. "Please," she whispered, and it was the first time Choax had heard her voice break. "I'm sick. The chains are making me sick." "Then perhaps you're ready to apologize," Blackwood said. "Get on your knees and beg my forgiveness, and maybe I'll consider making you more comfortable." Even in her weakened state, the woman straightened her shoulders. "Never." That single word, spoken with such quiet determination, sealed Choax's fate. He had heard enough. He had seen enough. Whatever the consequences might be for his people or himself, he could not stand by and watch this continue. That night, as he sat by his small campfire deep in the forest, Choax began to plan. He was just one man against an entire ranch full of armed whites, but he had advantages they didn't know about. He knew these forests better than any white man ever could. He could move silently and strike quickly. Most importantly, he was fighting for something that mattered more than his own life. The rescue would have to be perfect. One mistake would mean death for both him and the woman he was trying to save. But as he sharpened his knife and checked his bow, Choax felt a calm certainty settle over him. This was the right thing to do, no matter what it might cost him. Tomorrow night, when the moon was dark and the ranch was quiet, he would make his move. The night was darker than black coffee when Choax made his move. There was no moon, and thick clouds covered the stars like a heavy blanket. Perfect conditions for what he had to do. He had spent the entire day preparing, gathering the tools he would need and studying every detail of the ranch layout. From his hidden camp, he had fashioned a set of metal tools from pieces of old iron he had found near an abandoned mining camp. Working the metal had taken hours of patient hammering and shaping, but now he had what looked like crude keys and prying tools. He wasn't sure they would work on the heavy shackles, but they were his best hope. He had also prepared a small pouch of healing herbs and salves that his grandmother had taught him to make. The woman would need medical attention immediately, and there would be no time to waste once they started running. Choax moved through the forest like a ghost, his years of hunting experience serving him well. Every footstep was placed carefully, every branch pushed aside silently. He had painted his face with mud and charcoal to blend with the darkness, and his dark clothing made him nearly invisible against the night sky. The ranch was quiet when he reached the edge of the tree line. Most of the buildings were dark, though he could see a faint glow from one window in the main house where someone was probably reading by lamplight. More importantly, he could see the guards. Blackwood had posted 2 men near the main buildings, but they were clearly not expecting trouble. One was leaning against a fence post, his rifle propped beside him as he dozed. The other was sitting by a small fire, more interested in staying warm than watching for intruders. These men were used to easy duty, not real danger. Choax waited in the shadows for over an hour, studying their movements and timing their rounds. The guards were lazy and predictable, walking the same path every 20 minutes and spending most of their time near the fire. The stone building where the woman was held was at the far end of the compound, away from the main activity. When the guards settled down for what looked like another long break by their fire, Choax made his move. He crossed the open ground between the forest and the buildings in a low crouch, using the shadows of the outbuildings to hide his approach. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure the guards would hear it, but his breathing stayed calm and controlled. The stone building was exactly as he remembered it. Heavy wooden door with a thick iron bar across it to keep it locked from the outside. The walls were solid stone, impossible to break through quietly. The door was the only way in or out. Choax pressed his ear against the wooden door and listened. For a terrifying moment he heard nothing and wondered if the woman was still alive. Then he caught the sound of shallow, labored breathing from inside. She was alive, but barely, working as quietly as possible. He lifted the heavy iron bar and set it aside. The door creaked as it opened, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the still night air. Choax froze, listening for any sign that the guards had heard. When no alarm came, he slipped inside and pulled the door closed behind him. The smell hit him immediately. Infection, fever, and human suffering all mixed together in the stale air of the small space. He had to breathe through his mouth to keep from gagging. In the darkness, he could barely make out a small figure huddled against the far wall. "Who's there?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from days of thirst and fever. Choax knew she would be terrified. A strange man entering her prison in the middle of the night could only mean more trouble in her experience. He had thought about this moment and prepared a few English words that might help calm her fears. "No hurt," he said quietly in his broken English. "Help you." Margaret's breathing became more rapid. In the darkness, she couldn't see who was speaking, but the voice was different from Blackwood's or any of his men. It was younger, gentler, and carried an accent she didn't recognize. "Please don't," she whispered, pressing herself further against the stone wall. "I can't take any more." Choax understood her fear. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small piece of flint and steel. Striking them together, he created a tiny spark of light that illuminated his face for just a moment. Long enough for Margaret to see that this was not one of Blackwood's men. "Modoc," he said simply, pointing to himself. "Help!" Margaret had heard about the Modoc people, of course. The settlers talked about them constantly, usually with fear and suspicion. But looking at this young man's face in the brief flicker of light, she saw something she hadn't seen in weeks: kindness. "You're here to help me?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. Choax nodded, though she couldn't see the gesture in the darkness. He moved closer, his hands outstretched to show he meant no harm. When his fingers found the iron shackles around her wrists, he could feel how swollen and infected the skin had become, working by touch alone. He examined the locks holding the shackles closed. They were simple but sturdy, designed more to cause suffering than to provide real security. He pulled out his makeshift tools and began working on the first lock. The metal was stubborn, and his crude tools weren't perfect for the job. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he worked, knowing that every minute they spent in this place increased their chances of being discovered. Margaret held perfectly still, afraid to move and disturb his work. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the first lock clicked open. Margaret gasped as the iron fell away from her left wrist, leaving behind a ring of infected flesh. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. "Thank you," she breathed, tears streaming down her face, but Choax was already working on the second lock. This one was even more stubborn than the first, and he had to stop twice when footsteps passed near the building outside. Each time, they both held their breath and waited for the danger to pass. When the shackles around her wrists were finally free, Margaret wanted to sob with relief. But Choax was already kneeling at her feet, working on the ankle restraints. These locks were in better condition and opened more easily, but Margaret's legs were so weak from days of confinement that she could barely feel them. "Can you walk?" Choax whispered in English, the words coming slowly as he searched for the right pronunciation. Margaret tried to stand but immediately collapsed back to the ground. Her legs simply wouldn't support her weight after so many days in chains. The infections from the shackles had weakened her entire body, and fever had left her dizzy and disoriented. Without hesitation, Choax scooped her up in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body wasted from poor food and illness. He could feel the heat of fever radiating through her torn dress. "Hold on," he whispered, though he wasn't sure she understood. Opening the door carefully, Choax peered out into the night. The guards were still by their fire, but one of them was standing now, stretching and looking around. In a few minutes, they would probably make another round of the buildings. There was no time to wait for a better moment. Choax stepped out of the stone building with Margaret in his arms and began moving toward the forest as quickly as he dared. Every step seemed to take forever, and he expected to hear a shout of alarm at any moment. They were halfway to the tree line when disaster struck. Margaret, weakened by fever and overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances, began to shiver uncontrollably. The movement caught the attention of one of the guards, who happened to be looking in their direction. "Hey!" the guard shouted, jumping to his feet. "What's that over there?" The alarm bell began ringing immediately, its harsh sound cutting through the night air like a knife. Lights appeared in windows throughout the ranch as people woke up to the commotion. Dogs began barking, and Choax could hear men shouting orders to each other. "There!" another voice yelled. "By the tree line! Someone's got the girl!" Gunshots exploded in the darkness behind them as Choax plunged into the forest with Margaret still in his arms. Bullets whistled through the trees around them, splintering bark and sending pine needles raining down on their heads. But once they were in the forest, the advantage shifted to Choax. This was his territory now, and no white man could follow where he was about to lead them. The real escape was just beginning. The forest swallowed them like a living thing. Choax moved through the darkness with Margaret in his arms, following paths that existed only in his memory and his people's ancient knowledge of this land. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder as Blackwood's men crashed through the underbrush with their torches and rifles. Find them! Blackwood's voice boomed through the trees, filled with a rage that promised terrible consequences.
I
Want that girl back alive, and I want whoever took her brought to me in pieces. But the white men were stumbling blind through territory that Choax knew like the back of his hand. He led them through dense thickets that tore at their clothes, across streams that would wash away their scent, and over rocky ground that left no tracks. With each passing hour, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness as they traveled. The fever had taken hold of her completely, and she mumbled incoherently about her father, about chains, about wanting to go home. Troax whispered soothing words in his own language, though he knew she couldn't understand them. The tones seemed to calm her restless movements. By dawn, they had traveled more than 10 miles through some of the roughest country in the territory. Choax finally stopped at a hidden canyon where a small stream bubbled over smooth rocks and tall pines, provided shelter from prying eyes. More importantly, this was where he had arranged to meet his people if anything went wrong during his scouting mission. The Modoc camp was small and temporary, just a few families who had left the main village to hunt and gather winter supplies. When Choax emerged from the forest carrying an unconscious white woman, the reaction was immediate and intense. "What have you done?" demanded Grey Wolf, an older warrior who served as the group's leader. "Do you want to bring the soldiers down on all of us?" Troax gently laid Margaret on a bed of pine boughs near the stream. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and the infected wounds on her wrists had begun to smell of poison. Without immediate help, she would die within days. "I found her chained like an animal," Troax explained to the gathered Modocs. "The white man Blackwood was torturing her, trying to break her spirit. I could not stand by and watch." An elderly woman named Winema pushed through the circle of warriors. She was the group's healer, respected for her knowledge of medicine and her wisdom in difficult situations. One look at Margaret told her everything she needed to know. "This woman is dying," Winema said simply. "The poison in her blood is spreading. If we do nothing, she will be dead before the sun sets again." "Then we do nothing," Grey Wolf said harshly. "We cannot risk our families for one white woman, no matter how much she has suffered." But Winema was already kneeling beside Margaret, examining her wounds with practiced hands. "Look at these marks," she said, pointing to the ring of infected flesh around Margaret's wrists. "No human being should be treated this way, white or Indian. Our ancestors taught us to show mercy to those who cannot defend themselves." A heated argument broke out among the adults. Some agreed with Grey Wolf that helping Margaret was too dangerous. If Blackwood found their camp, he would use it as an excuse to attack all Modoc people. The tensions between their peoples were already at a breaking point. Others, led by Winema and some of the younger warriors, argued that they had a moral duty to help. To turn away from suffering when they had the power to stop it would dishonor everything their culture stood for, while the adults argued Margaret's condition grew worse. Her fever spiked so high that she began shaking uncontrollably. Foam appeared at the corners of her mouth, and her skin took on a grayish color that Winema recognized as a sign of approaching death. "Enough talk," the old healer said firmly, cutting through the argument. "I will not watch someone die when I have the medicine to save them. If the consequences fall on my head alone, so be it." Winema went to work with a skill that amazed even her own people. She cleaned Margaret's wounds with water that had been boiled with special herbs, then applied poultices made from plants that grew only in certain parts of the forest. She forced bitter teas between Margaret's lips and sang healing songs that her grandmother had taught her decades ago. For 3 days, Margaret hovered between life and death. Her fever would break for a few hours, giving everyone hope, then return with even greater intensity. Winema barely left her side, constantly adjusting treatments and monitoring every change in her condition. Choax stayed close by as well, helping Winema with her treatments and serving as a translator when Margaret was conscious enough to speak. During her lucid moments, Margaret was confused and frightened to find herself among strangers. But gradually she began to understand that these people were trying to help her. The breakthrough came on the 4th morning. Margaret's fever finally broke for good, and her eyes opened with genuine awareness for the first time since the rescue. She was weak as a newborn kitten, but the dangerous flush was gone from her cheeks. "Where am I?" she whispered, looking around at the Modoc camp with wonder. "Safe," Choaks answered in careful English. "You are safe now." As Margaret recovered her strength over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. She began to learn about Modoc culture, and what she discovered amazed her. These people, who the settlers called savages, treated their women with a respect she had never experienced in her own world. Modoc women could own property, make important decisions for their families, and speak their minds without fear of punishment. The idea of forcing a woman into marriage was so foreign to them that they struggled to understand how Margaret's father could have treated her that way. "In our tribe," Winema explained one day as they sat by the stream, "a woman chooses her own husband. If he treats her badly, she can send him away. Children belong to their mother's family, not their father's." Margaret listened with growing amazement. Everything she had been taught about how the world worked was being turned upside down. She had always been told that women were naturally weak and needed men to protect and guide them. But here were women who were strong, independent, and valued for their wisdom and abilities. During her recovery, Margaret also learned practical skills that would have been unthinkable in settler society. Winema taught her which plants could heal and which could harm, how to track animals through the forest, and how to read the signs that predicted changes in weather. The other women in the camp accepted Margaret with a warmth that surprised her. They were curious about her life among the settlers, but not judgmental about the differences in their cultures. They seemed to understand that she had been a prisoner in her own society just as surely as she had been Blackwood's prisoner in that stone cellar. Meanwhile, Blackwood and his men continued to search for Margaret, but they were looking in all the wrong places. He had sent riders to nearby towns, offered rewards for information, and even contacted the territorial authorities. But he never thought to look for her among the Modoc people. In his mind, Indians would either kill a white woman immediately or return her for a reward. As autumn turned to winter, Margaret faced the biggest decision of her life. Word had reached the camp that her father believed she was dead. Blackwood had told everyone that she had been killed by hostile Indians during her escape attempt. A funeral had even been held, and her few possessions had been sold to pay her father's debts. "You could return," Choaks told her one evening as they walked along the stream. "Tell them what really happened. Blackwood would be forced to face justice for what he did to you." But Margaret shook her head. "What justice? Who would believe me over him? He's rich and powerful, and I'm just a farmer's daughter who ran away from an arranged marriage. They'd say I was lying or that I brought it on myself somehow." She had thought about this possibility many times during her recovery. Even if people believed her story, what kind of life would she have? Her reputation would be ruined. No decent man would marry her after she had lived among Indians. She would probably end up working as a servant in someone else's house, always under suspicion, and never truly free. "There is another choice," Winema said quietly. She had been listening to their conversation from nearby. "You could stay with us, not as a visitor, but as one of our people." The offer was extraordinary. The Modoc people rarely adopted outsiders, especially not white settlers. But Margaret had proven herself during her time with them. She had learned their ways quickly, contributed to the work of the camp, and most importantly, she had shown respect for their culture instead of trying to change it. Margaret looked around at the camp that had become her home. These people had saved her life, not just from Blackwood's cruelty, but from a society that would have crushed her spirit just as surely. Here she could be herself without apology. She could speak her mind, make her own choices, and live according to her own values. "Yes," she said finally, her voice strong and certain. "Yes, I would like that very much." The ceremony that made Margaret a member of the tribe was simple but profound. She took a new name in the Modoc language that meant woman who broke her chains. It was a name that honored not just her escape from Blackwood, but her choice to break free from everything that had tried to limit her years later. When tensions between the Modocs and settlers erupted into open warfare,